Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is LTV Predictions to Drive Growth and Uplift ROI with Ruckus and Voyantis. So this is being recorded. I'll send an email with the link once the link is ready. And so let's feel free to engage in the chat. If you want to ask any follow-up questions, we'll try to get to them as quickly as possible. And now with our guest speakers, I guess, Anish.
Yeah, hi, my name's Anish. So my background was running growth for companies for about a decade. So I'm from the Bay Area, lived in San Francisco for a decade, moved to New York about 4 years ago, and started an executive recruiting firm specifically focused around senior leadership within growth, product, and analytics and marketing roles. And then as of this week, I think our team is up to about 19 people. I'm excited to kind of be a host for today's event.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eran. I am co-founder and CTO at Voyantis. Basically, in the last 10 years, I've been in the marketing landscape. First as one of the first employees at an edtech company called Takey, and then later as a founder of a mobile analytics company called Audience. That's basically.
Hey, everyone. My name is Ori. I am currently the Chief Digital Officer at Lennar. We are a home builder. We build about 60,000 single-family homes in the US every year. My job there is to figure out how we transition the traditional home buying process into a digital-first experience for customers. Prior to Lennar, I headed growth for a number of consumer tech startups, including 8 Sleep and Via.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scav. I'm Client Solution Manager at Facebook. Today at Facebook, I'm working mostly with digital health disruptors, different B2C focused global companies, especially focusing on how to help them better understand, analyze data, and create smart business decisions based on complex modeling of their data. Prior to Facebook, I've been at the academy doing some research relating to post-stroke patients.
Awesome. So as folks have RSVP'd for today's event, all of you put in questions that you'd be interested in having our experts kind of touch upon. And so we pulled out I think it's about 10 of the most interesting questions that all of you have asked. Put them in this deck, and we'll sort of go through as many as we can kind of dig into to have our experts, give their insights. This one might be really great for Eran, considering he probably thinks about this all day. But what are the variables that you recommend a company to look into to define LTV? And this is a great question because you'd think that LTV has a broader definition that could be taken from company to company, but I've actually noticed that everyone kind of calculates it a little bit differently, and it's not necessarily even based on their product or company. It's just someone happened to read an article somewhere and said like, oh, this is how we define it because this article said it. So I'd love to know like how you approach that and how you've seen it work at different companies. Plus, what you think is kind of the best way to think through how to define it.
Thanks, Anish. So just maybe a few more words on background. So Voyantis works with marketers to basically activate their data lake. We connect to the data lake. We build an LTV model, and we'll talk about LTV in a second. And then we basically plug into the marketing platforms, Facebook, Google, and so on, and just create a new signal, which is a predictive LTV optimization goal, instead of optimizing on purchase or subscription and so on. So in that case, first of all, this question can be read in 2 different ways. It could be read in how do you define LTV, or how do you identify the things that drive LTV? I'll try answering both of them really quickly. So how do you define LTV? So it basically is just the sum of revenues expected over or observed over some period, maybe lifetime period, maybe not. What is lifetime? That's a philosophical question. So most companies do not have enough history to actually define a lifetime for a user. So it's more often usually 12-month LTV, 24-month LTV, 4 years or 5 years LTV if you're lucky, and so on. So it's not actual lifetime. I would say depending on your business model and the way you basically drive other users into your platform, you should also take into account anything around friend invites or teammates added, any shares to social networks, and so on. So as much as you can measure it in an attributable way. So if somebody joins because somebody else invited them and you've provided a code, an invitation code, and that is registered within your system, then you should load that next user's revenue into that first original inviters data. There's also a measure of how, I would say, the curve of the LTV. So how quickly somebody generates the revenue, because there's also the value of money, right? So getting $100 2 years from now and getting it in 2 months is not the same. So that's basically the main things I would look at. If the question is about what variables actually predict a strong LTV, then there are some very general, easily transferable things such as session length, number of sessions, different unique days or hours of the day that people engage with your product, and then it goes into some different business models. So how quickly do you go into trial mode if it's a trial? How many searches you made in a marketplace, right? How many items you added to cart, how many friends you invited, and so on. So there's no end to going down, and basically each one, I would say this: ask yourself basically what would you look at first to say if a campaign performs well other than revenue. That's usually the first hint of what you should look at.
Cool. And some of those measuring sticks, I guess, does it depend on whether you sell a physical good? Because you mentioned friend invites, other things like that.
Yeah.
So let's say someone is, let's say a D2C company, and is selling sort of like a physical good, and they have 3 months of data, around, let's say they sell jackets for $100 each. How would you sort of like circle back to say, with your 3 months of data, here's how I would think of it? Would you just take, the 3-month average and then spread that out to 12 months, or would you go a little more intricately than that?
Well, there's basically the basic models are called buy till you die. In this case, it's called non-contractual. It's just a model that models how long a person will still be active, as in has a chance of purchasing, and that is multiplied by how often they will purchase. There are pretty easily available models, free open source model that any engineer can basically enable, but you need an engineer for that. So I would look at that data and do that. If you don't have that engineer, I would basically try to do some kind of extrapolation. Usually you assume that even though it's not subscription business, a cohort's revenue would probably start diminishing exponentially. So just use an Excel, do this 3-month ROAS, and just try to extrapolate from there. ARPU or ROAS, it doesn't matter. It's the same kind of extrapolation given the CAC. So that's the most low-hanging fruit.
Okay, that makes sense. And when you say it diminishes exponentially, are you assuming some loss if someone's looking at 3-month data by like the 9 to 12-month cohort?
Yeah, exactly. So if month over month you see like a 90% drop, sorry, a 10% drop, like a 90% retention of the same revenue recurring, then you can assume that. For subscription businesses, basically, I wouldn't use the first month over month, but the second one, because it usually the first one is like a stronger drop, and then it usually the next 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5 are more similar to each other. That's what we've seen.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And did anyone else have anything to kind of dig into that in terms of how you've seen LTV calculated and some interesting variables that you've noticed people have kind of thrown in there that either made sense or, just as importantly, have not made as much valuable sense?
I'll just add, just for D2C businesses, specifically, if you think about physical goods, I think looking at kind of profit versus revenue is usually a consideration, especially if you have several categories of products where you have different margin. So, if someone's buying a t-shirt versus they're buying, a jacket, and those have materially different profit margins, that might be an important considerations. And then also specifically for selling physical goods, looking at return rate and also propensity to use promotions. So, if you have cohorts of users that are more likely to return your product, that severely affects the LTV. And also you sometimes see, especially as you acquire customers through promotional marketing and campaigns that heavily rely on kind of first purchase discount, just thinking, how likely is this person to buy without a discount? And those are two really important factors that determine the overall kind of LTV to your acquisition cost ratio for the.
That's a really good point. If you're giving away your first product for free, it's hard to really just net that out through all the way through.
And those customers are more likely to use discounts moving forward. So it's not just your first purchase. So thinking through that as from a core.
That's really interesting. I think I've seen that with a lot of businesses as well, where if someone is given an offer, they don't purchase again unless they're getting an offer as well. So would you almost make two different LTV models based off of one 0 discount users and another discounted users, or you really think it's better to just blend it all together for like broader health of the business?
I'll defer to Eran to kind of, to answer what's the right way to model on this, but I would assume you might just want to have those as a consideration in one holistic model, but I'll let Eran answer that one.
Yeah, it's not about how many models you have. It's about to differentiate between those kind of segments within the model. That depends on two things. One, how ubiquitous they are. I mean, if it's 1% of your traffic, of your paying users, then it's probably not worth the noise it will bring into. But if it's 20%, then yes, I would. So we basically, if there's a segment that is significantly behaving differently, and this is just one example of that, another example would be users that purchase very quickly versus users that take their time and purchase later on, even maybe outside of the conversion window of the networks, then these segments behave so differently that it makes sense to address that.
That actually makes a lot of sense, and I guess it probably has a lot of relevance to Ori's current role, since you're selling an incredibly expensive product, right? So those conversion windows are probably really, really long. So are you able to? Does that give you a lot of trouble in trying to figure out how to circle back and figure out what LTV is? And if you wouldn't mind giving a quick rundown of the product that you're sort of selling these days.
Sure. So we, the company I work for, Lennar, we sell homes. We build communities, design the homes on them, and then sell them directly to the public over the course of multiple years. And we do that at every given time at about 1,500 different locations in the country. And really, the funnel for us is more similar to a lead gen funnel more than a D2C purchase funnel, because usually the way it works today is, you have to drive interest and then engage that lead or that person who's interested in the home with a salesperson, and then it really becomes a sales funnel type of experience. That person would then go in to visit the home, often multiple times, and then at some point they would sign a contract to buy that home. And one of the things we look at is how what elements of that journey you could actually move online, so you could have a more trackable and more understandable journey, but also a more convenient journey for customers. And a lot of the challenge is, how do you connect the points? How do you know that a person who has responded to a Facebook ad is the same person that walked into one of our communities and talked to the salesperson 2 weeks later, right? And how do you connect that? So there's multiple ways to do that. I can talk about this for the entire day. But I think for us, really, what we care about, especially as we optimize media, is thinking about, how do we know it's a meaningful interaction and there's meaningful interest, garnering that session. So, the easiest example is if someone signed up for a call, signed up as a lead, and kind of scheduled a call with one of our salespeople. But most people would not do that on the first session, what we found, right? So it's really understanding kind of the depth of interaction with our content and the level of interest, and kind of using that to try to predict what is the likelihood they'll actually engage with our sales process. So that's kind of how we think about that.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. I think, Scav, you were going to mention something. I think across everyone, you probably, see the most variety of the ways people are thinking about this, given you work with a lot of different clients.
Yeah. So basically, when we talk with different companies from different industries, whether it's commerce, B2Bs, fintechs, etc., about LTV, usually we try to define or identify with them the data sources they should look at. And the most obvious or immediate ones are always the transactional data, all the purchase histories they have. And then later we have other data sets which are super important, especially for e-commerce, but sometimes overlooked. For example, all the product usage, either if it's digital product like an app, so we have a lot of usage or patterns within your app you can use. If it's online or marketing funnels, so you have a lot of, sometimes it's anonymous users because you don't have any login information, but still the data from this traffic is usually super important when you come to build an LTV model in many cases. And there is actually even a public case study made by asus.com in 2017 available in Google Scholar actually, about how they built in-house their LTV model, which parameters they look at. And what they found out is that most of the basically most of the weights within that LTV model they built relied mostly on transaction history and on web and app session logs, and not as much on demographic data, for example. And in many cases, when advertisers come to us and talk about LTV, they straight away start to talk about, demographics, and they want to know whether, which cities, which demographics have higher LTV. And actually, in many cases, the answer lies within the patterns of the usage and not the human, let's say, generated demographics, which are much more simpler to grasp, but in many cases doesn't have the answer for LTV.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And do you feel like a lot of your clients come to you with their own LTV kind of models and predictions, or are taking what the Facebook platform is kind of giving them and utilizing that? Like when you're working with clients, is it mostly them coming to you, or them with what they've already built and getting your feedback, or them saying, hey, can you actually just tell us what to do? And seeing some level of sort of similarity between what they're doing.
That's a great question, actually, because a lot of clients and advertisers and people in the industry, in different industries, talk about LTV. But to be honest, most of them have either a very basic model to no model, where even those who say we know our LTV are basically calculating what we call ad hoc LTV or actual LTV, meaning they just look back and they say, okay, our average LTV for a specific segment is that, and we assume that's going to be the LTV for that future segment. So we're going to focus on that segment. So first, they define the LTV based on averages on segments they were able to define with their own logic, but in many cases, these segments are not the right segments to look at. And second, these are not really models, rather just simple statistics applied on their data. When we talk about LTV models from our perspective, we talk about trying to create some sort of a live prediction system, which is able to give you predictions in real time, validated predictions where you can see how your LTV evolves, optimize the campaigns based on that. And when the business changes, and we saw with how in recent year and a half, the whole world changed a lot, the model needs to change, the data is changing. So you have to adapt very quickly. You can't just rely and say, okay, the LTV I had 2 years ago is the LTV of this segment.
Makes a lot of sense. And is that because the customer activity is evolving and there's new factors that get introduced every year, like just broad ad performance? And when you say people come with basic models, are they just saying, well, we've been alive as a company for the last year and here's how much on average people spend, and they just sort of call that their LTV?
So in many cases, yes. Some companies have a bit more advanced models for either LTV or models which are more aimed at retention. For example, RFM model, which is more of a customer ranking model for existing customers. I would say that only some few companies have actual real LTV models that they take actions based on, and that's the actual point here. The goal is not to be able to calculate or know the LTV. The goal is to be able to make impactful business decisions based on these numbers you calculate. Otherwise, they're just numbers.
That's great. And I haven't heard RFM for a decade. I thought that sort of fell out of fashion. And for those that don't know, RFM means recency, frequency, and monetization. So how recent someone kind of made a transaction with you, how regular they've made a transaction 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, whatever. And then the amount that they've made these transactions on. And that's your cohort. So you know, like, oh, these are our highest value cohorts because they purchased recently, frequently, and with a high dollar value, and then goes down from there. But I haven't heard that. Has that been going out of fashion a little bit more? Because I just haven't heard that term in a while.
So it gets thrown around recently more. There are other, like, let's say, all tactics which come or surface back up. One example is marketing mix modeling, which is a super traditional method for trying to understand the influence of different marketing channels in an aggregated way on the actual sales you see without or instead of attribution in a way. And similar to marketing mix modeling, or in short MMM, RFM is a term which we hear more recently with changes in the ecosystem, etc., where marketers are looking basically for more ways to be able to understand the customers better and optimize them better. And RFM is still a method which can be valid for some clients, but to be honest, today we have more advanced ways to understand retention or to build models for retention. As Eran mentioned earlier, RFM is more similar to the buy until you die methods, the simple statistical models which just try to rank or basically evaluate the distribution of your customers. And prediction models we build today are, or we try to build today with clients, are on the more sophisticated side of actual machine learning models, which learns over time and evolve.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. And so the next question here is, how do you move from insights from LTV models to actions? Obviously, Eran does a great job of telling people what their LTV could end up being, and you know, roughly is based on all the data up until that exact point. But okay, great. So now you know you fundamentally calculated that your estimated LTV is, you know, $145 for your users across the board blended. What do you do with that information after that?
Is that for me?
Yeah, or anybody. I think it's a
okay, happy to jump in. Well, there's the traditional way of using that kind of information, and that would be aggregating it at the cohort level for a campaign and cohort, and then basically comparing the cost of acquisition after whatever attribution model was applied to comparing it to the predicted LTV. And so, and you can also do like LTV predictions for different time ranges. So you can do 1-year LTV, 2-year LTV, and so on. And from that, you can not only get the expected ROAS, but you can get the expected payback period, which is usually very, very valuable in planning cash flow and marketing spend. So that's one way of doing it. And it also does not require predicting LTV at the individual user level. All you need to do is be able to predict LTV at the cohort level. It does, though, require that you have attribution. So if you don't have attribution, or you don't have a good attribution model, this won't work well. And that's a whole different iOS 14, where does it put us question. But another way to use that, which I think is more valuable, is basically to do the prediction at the user level, which actually does not require any attribution data. It can use attribution data, but you don't need attribution data to build a model for a specific customer that came into your product. They engage with your product, they provide all kinds of signals, they make or do not make any transactions, and you make a prediction. Using that prediction, you now want to activate it. So I think the most valuable way to do it is to send it over to the ad networks as your optimization signal. And we do it as a service for our customers. But you can do it yourself. Like for Facebook, it's the copy, right? The conversions API server side. You can just send the events over there. Google has several ways of sending it to them. Snap has that. Other networks are following suit. This is very valuable because it basically effectively extend the conversion window. So instead of optimizing on the first 7 days, you're optimizing on the prediction for 90 days or 1 year, and you're sending that within the conversion window of 7 days. So if you're doing a good job of the predicting of the LTV, you'll basically be telling the network, this is a good user, this is a bad user, this is a long-term good user, and this long-term good user is worth twice from that one. That usually provides very valuable audiences and allows to increase scale significantly, because you're doing two different things. One, you're also targeting people that have not yet exhibited the usual event that you're optimizing on, so purchase or subscription or sign up or registration. That's one thing, and you're basically getting to a whole new audience, which most other marketers are not getting to, so they're also cheaper. So that really allows you to scale. Even if the LTV is not as large, the ROAS might still be better and more scalable. And the other thing that you'll be doing is you'll be saying the fact that somebody purchased a lot in the beginning does not mean that they are going to purchase a lot later on, right? We've seen cases where the users that purchased very quickly, but not a lot of dollar value, not a lot of conversion value in the beginning, but exhibited strong engagement with the product, were worth much more over the long run. So instead of being like, we call them the Angry Birds, they come in, they purchase something, but that's it. They burn out and they don't come back, and you'll pay a lot for more users like them. And that's not good efficiency on deploying your marketing spend. So basically, send it over to the networks, to the server-side API, and you should be getting much better results than what you've had until now, and much better scale.
Thanks for that.
Just want to add one more thing to what Eran said on this topic, which, I think obviously being able to optimize on actual LTV, not or rather predicted LTV versus just actions that you think are a proxy of LTV is tremendously valuable. The other, I think, area of value that some people, just it takes a while to realize is you're able to provide that signal much faster to the ad network. So especially if you look at long consideration products, for example, purchasing a home, or if you look even at subscriptions where you have a relatively long payback time or payback period, if you're providing the ad network the conversion signal with the full predicted LTV within a few days, your velocity of optimizing your campaigns is much faster. And you can get to the point where you can get much better results much more quickly than if you had to wait 3 months until that initial cohort ended up purchasing. Only then you would kind of create an audience from those people sending back. So there's a lot of velocity benefits to that as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And are there any concrete examples of how you've been able to utilize some of these LTV models, Ori, and like turn them into actual efforts on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also the question of how do you use the LTV framework as a decision-making tool generally for your kind of growth efforts and for your business. Obviously we all know that we'd like to invest more in channels and campaigns that drive higher value LTV. But if you think about all your other efforts, starting from, which promotions you're sending out, and also things like customer service rewards, and thinking from an LTV lens can provide a lot of value. So I can share, for example, an experiment we ran at VIA a few years ago. And this is actually something that we ended up publishing a paper with the NYU Business School, which was around how you compensate users that had a poor experience. And what we found, we looked at customers that, VIA is a ride-sharing platform. And, sometimes your car is late. There might have been, an issue or kind of bad traffic or unexpected traffic. And there's just a disappointing experience for the rider. And we've actually tested what happens if we, provide proactive compensation to that rider compared to not, waiting until they complain or just not doing anything. And what we've seen is obviously proactive compensation leads up to, more satisfied riders. And also in the long term, the LTV differences were massive because the engagement rate of riders who had a good experience turned out to be much higher over time. And we also tested that against, just providing people with a proactive compensation when they did not have a poor experience. For example, when it was their birthday. So we kind of use a control case to see is it just that the several dollars of credit, or is it actually the attention that we're providing you when you're have a poor experience. So, but using the LTV lens really helps you understand the value of those actions to just overall kind of long-term retention and value of users.
That's a really good experiment. And something that I think when folks are thinking about growth experiments, they're not thinking about how to incentivize and take care of customers out of poor experience, right? It's all about just trying to get your higher LTV customers and your normal purchasers just purchase more and more and more and more. So that's actually really interesting. I haven't heard that. And then how long did you have to track the experiment down to see that it paid off with more engagement from those users who were incentivized with something when they had a poor experience versus not?
I think it typically depends on what's the business and what's the average time between transactions. At Via, we had people who would ride 10 times a week. So you across that cohort or that segment, you see those differences accumulate very, very quickly. But also when you look at segments that are slightly less, the lower level of ongoing engagement, probably you need 3 to 4 weeks and you already see a very significant outcome. With businesses where the purchase might be less frequent, it might take much longer. It might take 6 months until you actually see an effect. So it really depends on the business.
I just like to point out that in this case, an LTV model is again very valuable, as in it's actually used to measure the effects of things that you do. You don't need to wait the 6 months or the whole 6 months to get an idea of the contrast of the test.
Yeah, it's great. And this is the first time I've ever hearing of like an angry customer cohort. So like, I'm pretty interested to see like all the experiments you can run with those people, like sending a little gift in the mail or something and anything else there. Cool. So the next question is, how do you think about LTV within the context of other metrics that your company tracks? I think it's particularly where I'm talking to consumer products organizations. The big metric that they seem to track is really closely is sort of like ROAS, which is not thinking about really long-term effectiveness too closely. So when companies and probably you get this a lot is Gav, where people are really just focusing on like first click ROAS, or maybe even 7-day or 14-day view throughs. But how do those conversations go, and what have you seen in terms of the way people's thinking either evolves or doesn't really evolve?
So definitely there's like this constant balance between growth and hyper growth and getting more users, getting more traffic, getting as much as sales as you can on one hand, when you have different like company goals, whether you need to show data to investors or whether you just need to get some results to get another round of investments. But the other side of the coin is whether you're building a sustainable business, meaning that whether the users you're acquiring today will stay with you long enough, right? So if you track only CPA and first day AOV or value, and we did this analysis with a few companies which used to look, for example, only on average order value of the first 24 hours, and show them that if they start to analyze LTV, not even with a very super smart model, just a model similar to what Eran mentioned earlier, they start to see that the LTV they see is very different and behaves differently between different, for example, channels, segments of products, etc. And not with a correlation to the average order value. So for example, one marketing channel had a very high average order value, but a super low LTV, while another marketing channel with a more decent AOV had a much higher LTV. And it really depends on the business. If you think about it on a one-time purchase business, LTV should be equal to average order value, right? But for most businesses, e-commerce specifically and subscription, obviously, that's not the case. They're not a one-time purchase business. And if they have returning customers, so tracking LTV is in many cases more important than tracking, for example, CPA. It obviously depends on your business goals, but in the end of the day, you could make a really good decision which will lower your CAC and increase your one-day revenues, but you'll discover that after 6 months, you actually decreased your potential revenues by a lot because of that decision.
Sorry, I was muted. Makes a lot of sense. I think for the most part, some people are a little bit too hopeful moving forward, particularly with consumer products companies, that things are going to pan out. But I've also seen the opposite, where some companies, after the fact, a year or two later, realized they were way too conservative because they were just focusing on individual ad performance, and then realized they were leaving, $100, $200 on the table per user because they were not scaling or not per user, but just the quantity of users, because they realized the LTV backed out really nicely, and they didn't need as many margins. They actually needed more users. So it is really fascinating seeing both ways. And do you see certain industries that either have gone one way or the other a little too much, where they've been a little too hopeful based on the LTV numbers and kind of overspent and realized, or on ROAS numbers, and realized kind of like the math doesn't work itself out, versus other industries where they're just leaving a little bit too much on the table while they're thought about like individual ad performance, but not the life, the lifetime of revenue?
So actually, I've seen it happen not in a specific industries. I've seen companies from different industries, both health industry, like health tech companies I work with, which are subscription based, where they relied too much on hopeful LTV and didn't focus enough on short-term revenue and growth of actual users, and they actually overestimated their potential LTV when they did their marketing. So they found themselves at in a situation where they are losing money because they basically didn't really calculate or try to calculate LTV. They just said, okay, we believe the LTV will be that. On the other end, I saw companies, and many companies underestimate LTV. And when they do the marketing, they always were super conservative. They always, worried about every dollar here and there on the CPA or CAC. And eventually, after 6 months or 1 year of activity on Facebook, on Google, on different channels, they came to us and told us, you were pretty much right all along, and we could probably spend much more and be in a different place now, where our competitor took over the market, over the share of voice, while we were too conservative regarding our margins, etc., because we didn't calculate our LTV correctly. So to your question, I would say it's not specific to any industry. I've seen it happen in B2Bs, in fintechs, in commerce, health, across the board, for both ways, actually.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That it doesn't speak to one industry being overly hopeful and others not. It's more so the specific team you're working with, or the founders and maybe the investors being overly hopeful on a case-by-case basis. So that's super interesting. And we see that with hiring as well, that, there isn't a whole lot of pattern between, this particular industry pays this certain salary versus this other industry, or hires faster or slower. It's really just the people working there have an appetite to hire more and hire more expensive people, and others just flat out don't. So that's super interesting. Can you jump on the next one, Grace? I imagine the answer to this question is pretty much everybody, but what types of products or brands, should be implementing LTV-based marketing strategy? Maybe reversing it. Is there anyone that shouldn't, or that where the effort isn't worth the payoff? I'm not sure if there is, but would love to hear from the experts.
Scav, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, probably everybody, but as I mentioned earlier, a few companies or a few businesses where the LTV when you validate it, and you don't need to go pretty much down the complex road of doing super sophisticated LTV models. If you try and start simple, and you see that the LTV is super close to your actual immediate ROAS, revenues, etc., and the business model makes sense as well, that should be the case. Like, I can give a very specific example, but let's say you're selling DNA kits, and that's your only business in a world where people buy only one DNA kit lifetime to, evaluate their DNA, and that's it, right? So for this business, there is no LTV basically, because people will not return. And I wouldn't say it's binary, because it's some sort of a scale. If you have 1% returning customers, so LTV might not be the first priority to seek, or an approach you should go after. But for most companies, where we see above 10, 20, 30% returning customers and above that. So LTV should be a priority in marketing, business decisions, etc.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think Ori used to sell mattresses, which are known for like being 7 years in between, right? And probably houses probably have even longer. So maybe you've seen a little bit of that.
Yeah, I think the longer the consideration cycle, the more you need to model out the propensity to purchase, which is equal to LTV in this case. And I think if you have a business that relies on very short funnel impulse purchase and can with the right CPA can drive a good margin from it, maybe LTV is not a huge priority for you, right? Because you really focus on that short-term ROAS. But I think there's very few businesses that are in this domain these days. Even if you're relying on impulse purchase, likely you're acquiring the customer with hoping on repeat purchases down the line in a number of months. So I really think LTV, thinking about LTV as a kind of primary area of value is very important to almost anyone who's kind of engaged in digital marketing.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's jump to the next one, Grace. How do you predict LTV with the limited attributed data across paid channels? I think much of you have talked about it, particularly Eran had dove into it with kind of taking a cohort approach. But yeah, I think a lot of people, particularly ones who are just starting off or maybe only spending a few $1,000s a month, would love to know how to better kind of understand, okay, well, hey, if I can 5X my spend, does it back out? So if there's any kind of like a couple things someone could think of who is working at a place where the spend's pretty low.
Of course, I'm not sure if the question is about the number of users in a cohort, or is it about limited attribution data because of cookieless IDFA, so
I think you're right. I think it's more about the less attribution data and losing some of those cookies. You're right.
So under that, again, I would say two things. First, there's no problem creating an LTV prediction for sending it over to the network. That's fine because it's the user level and you have all the data you need to do it. Yes, if you knew what campaign and channel they came from, it would help the model. But exactly as Gav said, the engagement data and the transaction data are more valuable in the model, and any user attributes, demographics, or channel they came from are interesting, but they lose their weight the longer you go into the user journey. However, if you still you still want to do cohort level analysis to make decision, kill decision, double down, and so on, then I would say, first of all, we're in a problem. Everybody has some kind of a problem on that. There are different ways that you could go about it. You could just use the opted-in part of the users, which of course has two main drawbacks. One, it's might be a very small percentage, so it will only work for very large campaigns or media units or channels. So you can maybe do a channel level analysis, but going down to the campaign, you'll only remain with 1 or 2 campaigns that have enough traffic so that 5 or 10% of them can be used. And the other thing is, of course, the fact that this might be a skewed distribution of users. It's a bias to the users that are allowed tracking, but it's still better than nothing, right? That's I would say basically the main the main way I would access it. You could go into a more complex model and try to predict which campaign each user came from using every bit of point of data that you have. I don't know of any company providing that kind of service right now as an active service. It's a very complex thing to do. That plus LTV prediction, because then it's basically almost probabilistic attribution, right? But not probabilistic in the forbidden sense. Not probabilistic as in I would look at your IP address and timestamp and try to understand you. It's probabilistic in the sense that just trying to understand each user which campaign they came from. And that's fine. And that is, I think some attribution companies are working on that, but I don't know of anything that actually works in the world of IDFA, IDFA-less iOS 14.5. That's
makes sense. Yeah. I mean, there's some companies that are out there doing competitive research, right? Like an App Annie or something like that. But again, it's hard to take that data and I don't know. I
Yeah,
actually, I've never
not
used it
very
before
bad.
for any real purpose. So maybe it does have value. Maybe it doesn't. I'm not 100% sure.
I don't think it's relevant for understanding a specific campaign. If you're trying to understand
Okay.
a specific campaign, the best you could do basically is what Apple is allowing you to do. And that is, if you could model the user level, and that is basically what you should be doing. And we're also working on such a product, but we're still waiting to see how iOS 14.5 unfolds, because everybody is still struggling to see how they're going to use that. But you are still able to send a user level prediction through SKAd network, right? And we just said that we can do a user level prediction. So if you build the right model and you send it, then you will be able to do a cohort level aggregation through the postbacks into your BI. I know it sounds very, very complex, and it is, but basically everybody is going to have to send values and events into SKAd network if you're advertising natively on iOS. And the right model done quickly enough, so within a day or 2 days of a user clicking an ad, can be the solution to that.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Anyone else have any thoughts in there?
Yeah, I think another perspective on this is, how do you think about designing your online or kind of mobile experience to collect more valuable LTV signals? So, you know, a good example for that is, you know, you see a lot of companies kind of focus on collecting email addresses right out of the gate. You know, that's obviously, if someone is willing to give you their contact details, it's likely a good sign of kind of intent to either buy from you or to stay engaged. But typically it's not the best, kind of customer experience. You're not providing them a lot in return, maybe sometimes a promotion. But other approaches have been, you know, do you create some sort of kind of quiz experience or quiz funnel to personalize the experience? And that also gives you pretty rich information about preferences and interests of the customer that helps you model their LTV based on that. You see it a lot in subscription companies. But more generally, how do you add more layers of engagement to your product, right? So if you're an e-commerce company selling apparel, you know, how do you not only have a PDP page to show each kind of, each product SKU, but you also have a way to kind of, a virtual try it on or any other layer of deeper engagement. And that by looking at who's participating in that, you could kind of use that information to model what their predicted LTV is. So that's just thinking, how do you actually add richer experiences that are not just transactions?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Since most LTV models are just based on how much money is attributed to the user, how much money spent is attributed to each user. Exactly. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and especially since attribution is becoming more and more difficult, and it's harder to track the point of purchase to the point of acquisition, because there might be a few sessions in between, and you might not be able to retain the cookie. So being able on the first session to say, hey, I know that user has engaged at that level, and therefore they're a very likely user to purchase. That gives you a lot of very valuable information.
Makes sense. So this is obviously a broader question, but it might not be. It might be kind of address a lot of stuff we're talking about. But everyone who is selling a physical product through any of the major kind of advertising platforms is probably seeing declining return on ad spend. So the reason is because of some of the changes that Apple has made more recently in cookies. So what can be done here? What are some strategies and methodologies that some of these companies who are seeing that should sort of start undertaking?
I think a major theme here is, are you seeing a decline in directly attributed ROAS or overall ROAS? So if you're just looking at the one-day click ROAS versus your overall kind of funnel blended ROAS, like, is everything going down? Are you less effective in deploying your kind of advertising capital, or are you just able to attribute directly less of your purchases directly to the ads that you ran? And those are fundamentally two different things. Obviously, if your overall ROAS is declining, then you need to figure out how to evolve your strategies. And I don't want to give any advice here, because I think every business is different and every challenges are different. But I think, generally speaking, as digital marketers, we all need to become a bit more comfortable with not knowing as much as we did know, over the past few years, and not being able to attribute every single purchase to a single source, and being able to rely more on top-down approaches versus the bottom-up approaches. So, as Scav mentioned, media mix modeling. I think media mix modeling will have a pretty good comeback over kind of the next few months as people realize they need to rely more on top-down methods to really understand the impact of their spend.
And what is media mix modeling, and how do you do it?
Media mix modeling is basically looking at variations in spend across channels and attributing that to variations in revenue or purchases in your stream. So there's multiple ways to do it, to create those variations, either over time, as you stop and start or vary spend across the different channels, or you can do it geographically as well. But basically, you're looking at correlations into, how a change in spend on channel X in geography Y affected purchases within that geography, and then trying from that to infer what is the incremental contribution of that channel to your overall to your overall kind of revenue mix.
Makes sense. Thanks for that. Yeah, would love any ideas on how folks who are facing this right now should, any more ideas of how folks who are facing this right now should and could, utilize some strategies and efforts to help overcome it.
I think the other part, the other area of focus that I think is important is really focusing on first-party data and making sure that, when you acquire someone through a digital marketing campaign, if that person did not, or did the user did not convert on that session, at least, and if you're able to capture the contact information, either phone number or email, you can kind of use that to continue engage with them over time, provide content, and have an email strategy that will increase the likelihood of conversion. So, and I've seen that, kind of deployed a lot, because it's going to be harder and harder to attribute to that first session acquisition. By actually acquiring the contact details, you can extend your attribution window and say, yes, that customer has only purchased 3 weeks after they provided their email address, but now I know that they were acquired initially through that email campaign, and I have a better understanding of my funnel.
Okay, I think that makes sense. And I think we'll just stick to this question, considering this is probably what most people are worried about right now, who are kind of on this. If anyone would like to dig deeper and add a little bit more to what Ori was talking about.
I can add that we obviously try to assist clients in obviously gaining higher ROAS in their activities in the day-to-day, and the changes in recent, both with COVID, with Apple's changes. So we've been trying to help clients achieve better results, continue to see growth, etc., on Facebook specifically, and in general for the business. So as we mentioned earlier, media or marketing mix modeling is one way. Facebook today helps our clients to implement these type of models to measure their overall activities, to try to understand which channels are more effective or less effective. That's one example. And as Ori mentioned, we're seeing more and more companies and online marketers basically deploy these strategies of email collection, lead generation, login to the websites or platforms before purchase to increase engagement, and then to be able to create these types of audiences they will later be able to engage with again and convert, or at least create some sort of relationship with them for the long term. That's mainly what we see, and the decline in ROAS in many ways is some sort of a measurement challenge, but as Ori mentioned earlier, for a lot of companies, it's a decline in ROAS in reporting. It's not actually declining ROAS for the business. So they are not, in many cases, able to attribute the ROAS correctly, or they don't see the ROAS as they saw it, but the ROAS is still there for the company or in the bottom line for the business.
Interesting. Okay. I actually was unaware of that. So thanks for that, Darren. maybe is it easier to then use actual purchase data in the back end than just like ad performance on the front end to see, hey, I spent $1,000 this week and I made $1,000, on the back end. Although that doesn't really take into account LTV, which is what, I'm sure a lot of you would suggest more so focusing on. So I'm curious about how to think about that.
I think you need to look at blended ROAS very closely. So, blended, directly attributed ROAS is typically, you look at all the money you spend on Facebook campaigns, you look at all the purchases that came from Facebook, and you say, okay, what was the return on ad spend specifically from what I spent on Facebook? Blended ROAS is just looking at all the revenue you've made across your digital channels and looking at all your investment that you made through digital campaigns and understanding the ratio there. And I've seen some data, Thesis, they're a performance agency. They shared some data a few weeks ago comparing directly attributed ROAS to blended ROAS for about 20 of their clients in an anonymous way. And it's pretty astounding that most folks kind of run their directly attributed ROAS on, it could be a ROAS of like, 1 or 1.05, which means they get, for every dollar to spend, they get back $1.05. But the blended ROAS for those companies was always in the kind of 3 to 4x, which means overall they're making about 3 to 4 times the amount of revenue than they're spending on marketing, which kind of makes sense from an overall business perspective. So, just tracking the gap between that gap will widen with the fact that you can attribute less directed spend to your revenue, but making sure that your blended ROAS remains strong is really where the focus has to stay.
Makes a lot of sense. And I was unaware that, even some of the folks who are really worried about their single channel ROAS dropping, but their blended is actually in a pretty healthy place. So that's great to know. Well, we're at the end of today's session. I really want to thank our experts for jumping on here and giving us so much kind of insight